Okay, welcome everyone. We are going to be starting the upper extremity myology lesson today. So we will be covering muscles of the scapula, muscles of the shoulder joint, muscles of the elbow joint, muscles of the wrist, and some muscles of the fingers. So let's start with anatomical position, right? Instead of starting with this one here on the top left, let's look at this one here that shows anatomical position. Always a good place to start. So all the way up at the top, right? Even though this is at the bottom of the picture, but this is really the proximal portion of the upper extremity. Here's the scapula. And we are looking at the palm here. So we know here's the anterior palm, here's the anterior forearm, here's the anterior arm, and here's the anterior scapula. So in your mind, you're saying, all right, here's the anterior scapula. This fossa, this part of the bone was the subscapular fossa. So what rotator cuff muscle originates on the subscapular fossa is the subscapularis. That is an internal rotator of the shoulder. If we do internal rotation, right, internal rotation brings your arm downward like this. This is external rotation. This is internal rotation. Here is Teres Major. And remember, there's also a Teres Minor, and Teres Minor is a rotator cuff muscle, but we'll see it on a different view of the arm. Now we're looking at the anterior arm. The largest muscle that we see here on the arms anterior is the biceps brachii. This particular head right here is the short head of the biceps brachii because there are two heads, a long head and a short head. As we move back to the posterior part, the antagonistic muscle would be the triceps brachii. And what we can see here is tricep means three. So there is a long head, there's a medial head, and there's also a lateral head. But the lateral head, you can't see from a medial perspective. You'd have to be looking at it from the opposite view on the lateral side of the arm. So here's the medial head, and here's the long head. The long head pierces between Teres Minor and Teres Major. I'll show you that when we look at this view from the posterior side. The biceps brachii is a muscle that crosses two joints. It crosses the shoulder joint and it crosses the elbow. General rule of thumb is if a muscle crosses the joint, it has to act on the joint. So it has to act on the shoulder and it has to act on the elbow. Now you have to get comfortable with what the terminology is with the actions and know what they look like. So I do have a few videos on my YouTube channel of me performing the ranges of motion. I strongly encourage you go back and review some of those so that you know when I tell you that the biceps flexes the shoulder and flexes the elbow and supinates the elbow, you have a visual of what that looks like so that you're not just memorizing words. There is absolutely no benefit, zero benefit in just memorizing, well, the biceps flexes the elbow, flexes the shoulder, and supinates the elbow if you don't know what it looks like. Because in healthcare, right, most of you are taking anatomy and physiology because you're looking to get into healthcare or nursing. If someone hurts themselves or they have pain in their arm and they tell you the mechanism of injury, hey, I have so much pain right here in my arm, and it happened when I tried to catch a heavy load that was falling off a shelf, or my son or daughter was on the couch and I went to reach for them quick to catch them. And you can visualize the movement that they did and how the muscles contracted. You can actually diagnose and figure out which muscle could have been strained or possibly torn. So please go back and watch range of motion of the upper and lower extremity because the biceps flex the elbow, flexes the shoulder, and supinates the forearm. It is actually the strongest supinator when your elbow is flexed. In fact, if you take your right hand and you bend your elbow 90 degrees, you take your right elbow at 90 degrees and you put your left hand on your biceps and you pretend you have a screwdriver in your hand and you're turning the screwdriver clockwise to tighten something, you can feel your biceps brachii contracting every time you supinate. That's only when your elbow is flexed at 90 degrees. If your elbow is extended and you supinate, you're not going to get much biceps contraction. When we move down to the forearm, what I want you to understand is that many of the muscles of the forearm cross the elbow and they cross the wrist and some cross the fingers. So anything that's on the anterior forearm is either going to flex the wrist or flex the fingers, and they can flex the elbow. Anything on the anterior, you have to think perhaps it's going to flex the joint in some degree. The other thing I want you to look at is osteology-wise, what bony landmark do we have that's right over here on the distal end of the humerus on the medial side? It's called the medial epicondyle. So these group of muscles right here, the Pronator Teres, the Flexor Carpi Radialis, Palmaris Longus, and Flexor Carpi Ulnaris originate off of the medial epicondyle. So if you were to place your hand, your left hand, along the right medial epicondyle, and you flex and pump your fingers, you're going to feel movement right there along the medial epicondyle. Same thing, if you flex your wrist, you're going to feel a lot of pumping mechanism along the medial epicondyle because all of these flexor tendons are contracting. And it is involved with a sports-related condition called medial epicondylitis, aka golfer's elbow. It's from overusing these bellies of these muscles. When you look at their name, Flexor Carpi Radialis and Flexor Carpi Ulnaris, if you look at them and we go, all right, it's an anterior muscle. Well, Dr. Lindner said anything on the anterior arm is going to be a flexor. It looks like it's attaching to the carpals, so it's a flexor carpi. And is it on the radial side or is it on the ulnar side? Well, it's on the radial side, so it's going to be called Flexor Carpi Radialis. Let's go to the opposite side here. Again, it's on the anterior side of the forearm. So Dr. Lindner said it's a flexor. It attaches over here to where the pisiform is, which is a carpal bone. So it's a flexor carpi. And it happens to be on the ulnar side. So it's a flexor carpi ulnaris. Between the two, there is a palmaris longus because if we look at this, it has a very long tendon and it's going to cross, let me zoom in here, this tissue running transversely that looks gray has a few names. One name is the volar ligament. The other name is the transverse carpal ligament, transverse carpal ligament. And the third name is called the flexor retinaculum, flexor retinaculum. What the flexor retinaculum does is that it holds down all of these finger flexors. We could see all of these tendons are going deep to the flexor retinaculum, transverse carpal ligament, or volar ligament. They are anterior muscles that are deeper, right? These are superficial, but deep, we have finger flexors. So they go underneath that flexor retinaculum. And underneath the flexor retinaculum is a tunnel. It happens to be called the carpal tunnel. The carpal tunnel, where you have the median nerve and all these finger flexors. So the palmaris longus, This is the belly of it. This is the tendon, and it's the only tendon that is superficial to the flexor retinaculum. All of the others are deep to it, but the palmaris longus crosses superficially over the volar ligament, transverse carpal ligament, or flexor retinaculum. That's a unique feature. So you have flexor carpi ulnaris, flexor carpi radialis, palmaris longus. These three will all flex the wrist. But what's unique is that palmaris longus, since it's centrally located, does pure wrist flexion. But the flexor carpi radialis, because it's more on the radial side, not only does it flex the wrist, but it radially deviates it, aka abducts the wrist. Whereas the flexor carpi ulnaris flexes the wrist and ulnar deviates the wrist, meaning like a karate chop where the hand deviates in the direction of the ulna, aka wrist adduction or adduction. Okay, that's 1, 2, 3. The fourth muscle is the Pronator Teres, and that one simply pronates the forearm. The hand comes along for the ride, right? When you supinate and pronate the forearm, the hand moves along with it. But remember, the Pronator Teres is not attaching to the hand. Okay, this muscle here on the lateral side is the Brachioradialis. It's the only muscle in the body that originates at the distal end of one bone and goes to the distal end of another bone. So the brachioradialis originates at the distal end of the humerus on the lateral side, at the lateral epicondyle, and inserts on the radial styloid. It's the only muscle in the body that does that. It goes from the distal end of one bone and goes all the way to the distal end of another bone. Okay. What else do we have here in the thumb? These are called thenar pad muscles. The pinky muscles here are called the hypothenar pad muscles. Okay, so again, this is looking at the upper extremity superficially from the anterior side. Let's go and look at the same view, but now from the posterior side. Let's scroll up here and let's look at the shoulder, and we'll see here's the deltoid, here's the clavicle. So this portion is the anterior deltoid. Back here, posterior deltoid, and right in the middle, middle deltoid. So the anterior deltoid flexes the shoulder, posterior deltoid extends the shoulder, middle deltoid abducts the shoulder. Now we're looking at the arm. This is anterior, this is posterior, right? Because we're looking at it with the hand in this view. So you can see a little bit of the biceps brachii. This is the long head. And then there's a pretty thick muscle that's deep to it called the brachialis. So these muscles kind of sound a little bit alike, right? Biceps brachii, brachialis, brachioradialis. They all have to do with the brachium, which is the arm. The biceps brachii has two heads. The brachialis is shorter. It does not cross the shoulder like the biceps does. The brachialis only crosses the elbow. It is a strong, powerful elbow flexor. The brachioradialis, this is the only one that originates from the distal end of one bone, goes down and inserts on the styloid process of the radius. It too is an elbow flexor. I call it the politician muscle because it flexes the elbow while your hand is in the neutral position, like politicians love to shake hands. So we call it the politician muscle. Next to the brachioradialis on the forearm, everything back here, I think, are extensors. Anything on the back of the wrist and back of the forearm, I think of them as extensors because they're going to extend the wrist and extend the fingers. Remember, everything on the anterior side flex the wrist and flex the fingers. Everything on the posterior side will extend the wrist and extend the fingers. They're antagonistic to one another. There are two wrist extensors that are just adjacent to the Brachioradialis. One is ECRL and the other is ECRB. Extensor Carpi Radialis Longus, Extensor Carpi Radialis Brevis. When you grab the brachioradialis muscle, which is on your forearm, you're pinching what we call the mobile wad of 3. The mobile, meaning it moves, the mobile wad of 3 is 1, 2, 3. These 3 muscles, brachioradialis, ECRL, and ECRB. The tendons you can't quite see too well from this perspective, but the extensor carpi radialis longus is going to come down and insert somewhere along the 3rd metacarpal, and the extensor carpi radial, and let me say that again. I think I just want to make sure I get it right. ECRB, extensor carpi radialis brevis, will have an insertion along the longest finger on the 3rd metacarpal, whereas the extensor carpi radialis longus, which has a longer tendon, will insert at the shorter of the 2 fingers, which is the 2nd metacarpal. Both of them insert on metacarpals. It's just extensor carpi radialis brevis will insert on the longer finger, the 3rd metacarpal, and extensor carpi radialis longus inserts on the shorter of the 2 fingers, which is the base of the 2nd metacarpal. Okay. On the extensor side, there's a large muscle we see called extensor digitorum. It goes under this retinaculum. Remember, on the anterior side, it was called the flexor retinaculum. On the posterior side, it's called the extensor retinaculum. What is its function? Well, it's like a bracelet or a watch band that holds down all of these extensor tendons. It goes underneath it. So extensor digitorum, if we look at the tendons, they're going to go to digits 2, 3, 4, and 5. They're going to extend all the digits. The extensor carpi ulnaris, we look at it, it's going to originate, all extensors are going to originate off that lateral epicondyle. It's going to come down and insert right along the ulnar bone, right? It's crossing the ulna, it's crossing the carpals, and it's going to attach here on the ulnar side. So it's extensor carpi ulnaris. There's an extensor carpi ulnaris. There's a flexor carpi ulnaris. Flexor carpi ulnaris flexes the wrist and ulnar deviates. Extensor carpi ulnaris extends the wrist and ulnar deviates. Along the thumb side, there are these 2 muscles that kind of look like shorter version of these 2 that kind of run in that oblique angle. One of them is called the abductor pollicis longus, and the other is an extensor pollicis brevis. The abductor pollicis longus is more proximal. The extensor pollicis brevis is more distal. These 2 make up what's called the anatomical snuff box. The tendons do. When you raise your thumb up, like you're shaking someone's hand or hitchhiking, there is a depression right at the base of the wrist. It's called the anatomical snuff box. You can put your fingers right in that depression. And there are 3 muscles that do that. These are the 2 of them. The 3rd one is this one right here. Okay, that's the 3rd tendon. Okay, let's go back. Let's now look at the posterior scapula and the posterior arm. So let's zoom in here. Here's the deltoid. Since it's the back, this is the posterior deltoid. And now we're looking at 2 of the rotator cuff muscles. This right here, we can see a little bit of the spine of the scapula. So this is the infraspinatus, and inferior to that, I say inferior because remember the arm should be hanging down. In this picture, it's superior, but remember this is not an anatomical. So this is Teres Minor. Here's Teres Minor, here's Teres Major. The long head of the Triceps Brachii pierces between, it gets sandwiched between Teres Minor and Teres Major. And we know that the triceps, much like the biceps brachii, crosses two joints. It crosses the shoulder and it crosses the elbow. Its attachment is on the olecranon process of the ulna. So it extends the shoulder and it extends the elbow. Here is the medial head. Here is the lateral head. Medial head, lateral head, long head of the triceps. Okay, so we did the top three. Let's go and look at the anterior forearm. Let's zoom in on that again. So here's the anterior forearm. Now here's the elbow. There's the cubital fossa where blood is typically drawn on people. Here's the biceps brachii. So this fossa has a lateral border and a medial border. The medial border of the cubital fossa is the Pronator Teres, and the lateral border is the Brachioradialis. The Brachioradialis is the only muscle in the body that originates at the distal end of one bone and inserts at the distal end of another. It's named by its origin and insertion, Brachioradialis. Brachium, because it's lateral epicondyle. Radialis, because it's the styloid process of the radius. This is an elbow flexor from the neutral position, the handshaking or politician muscle. Here's the Pronator Teres. It too originates at the medial epicondyle, along with these muscles, which are the Flexor, Carpi, Radialis, and the Palmaris Longus, which we said is superficial to the Flexor Retinaculum. You could see it there. We can't see the Flexor Carpi Ulnaris here because we could see the thumb. We can't quite see what's on the medial side. Okay. You can see a little bit of the anatomical snuff box muscles, the Abductor Palmaris Longus and Extensor Palmaris brevis. Here's the Flexor Retinaculum. Here's the Extensor Retinaculum. Let's look again at the anterior, see if there's anything that we could, okay. So now here we're taking the same view, but now what we did is we rotated the hand a little bit more so that we're not looking at it just from the lateral view, but we can also see the medial aspect. So now you could see the Brachioradialis, a little bit of it. You could see the Pronator Teres, Flexor Carpi Radialis, Flexor Carpi Ulnaris, and right down the center of the palm, Palmaris Longus. That's the one that's superficial to the Flexor Retinaculum, whereas the Flexor Carpi Radialis and Flexor Carpi Ulnaris is deep to the Flexor Retinaculum. Here are the thenar pad muscles and the hypothenar pad muscles. Now, what we can see in the anterior forearm, deep to these superficial muscles, we can see the belly of another muscle here, the belly of the same muscle here, and the belly of the same muscle here. So deep to these tendons is a large muscle of the forearm's anterior, and that happens to be a major muscle that contributes to these tendons here that are going to go to the digits. And it's called the Flexor Digitorum Superficialis. Flexor Digitorum Superficialis. I'll show you it on another view with these superficial muscles dissected away. So we did this, we did this. Let's look at the posterior side of the forearm again, just honing in on that. So again, when we're looking at it from the posterior, we see the wrist extensors. Mostly everything on the back are going to be extensors. So the one going to the digits is extensor digitorum. The one that's on the ulnar side is extensor carpi ulnaris. The two along the thumb side, remember the thumb is called pollicis. One is an abductor pollicis longus. The other is an abductor pollicis brevis. And here's that third tendon labeled, which is the extensor pollicis longus. So there's an extensor pollicis brevis here, and this is the tendon of the extensor pollicis longus. These three make up the anatomical snuff box, which is this depression. It's called a snuff box because in the old days, people would put cocaine in the snuff box and snort it in their nose. So it's actually referred to as the anatomical snuff box. Crazy story, right? Okay, and then at the proximal portion, there's the brachioradialis. This is the mobile wad of three, right? It's three bellies. Brachioradialis, ECRL, extensor carpi radialis longus, and extensor carpi radialis brevis. The difference between longus and brevis is obviously I don't want to say obviously, but it is the length of the tendon. So if the tendon is long, it's given the term longus. If the tendon is short, it's given the name brevis. Okay. Okay, let's see which one this one is. Okay, so this is the medial aspect of the hand, and it's giving us a little bit of a mixed view. It's giving us the view of anterior and posterior, but from the ulnar side. So it's showing us a little bit of the flexor carpi ulnaris, and on the extensor side, the extensor carpi ulnaris. So they are antagonistic to one another. And then it's the extensor digitorum going to the digits 2, 3, 4, and 5. The extensor carpi ulnaris and extensor digitorum, they're going to originate off the lateral epicondyle, okay, of the humerus. Let's look at the posterior scapula. You know what? Let me hold off on that for a second. I want to go to the anterior forearm again with the superficial muscles dissected away. Okay. Now, if you take your right hand, and you take the thenar pad of your right hand and you place it over the left medial epicondyle and you display 4 fingers in this direction. The thumb would represent the Pronator Teres, the index finger, Flexor Carpi Radialis, the middle finger, Palmaris Longus, and then the ring finger, Flexor Carpi Ulnaris. So just displaying those 4 fingers would represent the superficial muscles that were cut away from here. Pronator Teres, and you could see here's the tendon of the Flexor Carpi Radialis. Here's the tendon of the Flexor of the Palmaris Longus. And then here is the Flexor Carpi Ulnaris. They didn't have to cut it, but with these cut, you can see the belly of this muscle, which is the Flexor Digitorum Superficialis. You can see it's a pretty large muscle. It goes underneath and it goes to the fingers. Okay. Let's go back. That's this one here. Let's look at this version. Again, this tendon is Flexor Carpi Radialis. It's cut. Here's Palmaris Longus. It's cut. Here's the Flexor Carpi Ulnaris. Now, Here's the Flexor Digitorum Superficialis, the muscle that I just went over, but you could see it's a superficial muscle by its name. They cut it. You could see the slice here so that we can see what's deep to it, which is the Flexor Digitorum Profundus. So the Flexor Digitorum Superficialis and Flexor Digitorum Profundus, both of these two are responsible for flexing the fingers. You could see here, Flexor Digitorum Superficialis would be the tendon here, and you can see it splits, right? There's a slit. There's a slit in each finger. One goes to the medial side of the middle phalanx, and this one goes to the lateral side of the middle phalanx. And because it splits, it gives or allows for the digitorum profundus, right, the flexor digitorum profundus, to pass through the tunnel and go to the distal phalange. Both of these are responsible for flexing the fingers. It's just that the flexor digitorum superficialis inserts on the middle phalanx, whereas the profundus goes all the way to the end and inserts on the distal end of the distal phalange. So it is responsible for flexing everything proximal to it. If we look at the flexor digitorum profundus, since it crosses the wrist, it flexes the wrist. Since it crosses the metacarpal phalange joint, it flexes that. Since it crosses the proximal and the distal interphalange joints, it can flex all the bones and all the joints. Flexor digitorum superficialis, it can flex the metacarpal phalange, and it can also flex the proximal interphalange joint, okay? It doesn't flex the distal because it doesn't cross the joint. Remember Lindner's rule. If a muscle or tendon crosses the joint, it's got to move the joint. Okay. So I think that's an important view because it really shows what's a little bit superficial. Flexor digitorum superficialis, it's cut, so you can see flexor digitorum profundus, and then you could see the flexor retinaculum. You could see flexor carpi radialis cut, palmaris longus cut, and the one that's not cut is the flexor carpi ulnaris on this side. It inserts into the pisiform. Here's your thenar pad and hypothenar pad muscles. Okay, so we did this, and this. Let's just see what this one has. Okay, nothing worth writing home about there. Let's go to the scapula again. Let's look at the spine of the scapula is here. This is the supraspinatus because it's above the spine. Below the spine of the scapula is the infraspinatus. And then we have Teres Minor. So right here is sit, S-I-T. The rotator cuff muscles are called sits. So where's the last S? On the other side, it's the subscapularis. Supraspinatus, infraspinatus, and Teres Minor, we could see from the posterior. They all insert on the greater tubercle of the humerus. The supraspinatus originates on the supraspinous fossa. Infraspinatus originates on the infraspinous fossa. And on the other side, which is the subscapularis, that originates on the subscapular fossa. Here's Teres Minor. Remember, Teres Major is not a rotator cuff muscle. These two are antagonistic to one another. Teres Minor is an external rotator. I'm sorry, Teres Minor is an external rotator. Teres Major is an internal rotator. And what belly or tendon is this right here that passes between Teres Minor and Teres Major? That is the long head of the triceps. Let's look at the subscapularis now from this view. Here's the subscapularis, which is an internal rotator of the shoulder. Here's the coracoid process. This is the short head of the biceps right here. And this is the coracobrachialis. It gets its name by its origin and insertion. Coraco, because it originates on the coracoid process. Brachialis, because it inserts onto the brachium. Okay, now I want to do one other thing. Let me see if I can, let me see if I have a whiteboard that I can show you. Okay. Now, I want to, hopefully you can see this. If you can't, you can tell me. So here is sits, okay? This is the rotator cuff muscles, supraspinatus, infraspinatus. We'll put a little M here for minor, Teres Minor, and then we have the subscapularis. These three here all insert on the greater tubercle of the humerus. The subscapularis inserts on the lesser tubercle of the humerus. The actions of the supraspinatus, we're going to say AB for abduction. We're going to say EX for external rotation. Teres Minor, we'll put EX for external rotation. And then the subscapularis will put IN for internal rotation. So the actions of the rotator cuff muscles, which is interesting, all of them rotate except for the supraspinatus. That's an abductor. But the other three are responsible for rotation. So now let's take a look at what they look like. AB, in your head, I want you to remember AB, EX, EX, IN. That's an order of sits. AB, EX, EX, IN. So what does that look like? So on me, if I go like this, that's AB for abduction. When I go like this, that's external rotation. So it's AB, EX, EX again for external rotation, and then IN for internal rotation. So what's the action of the rotator cuff muscles? AB, EX, EX, IN. Again, do it with me. AB, EX, EX, IN. Abduction, external rotation, internal rotation. Supraspinatus, infraspinatus, Teres Minor, subscapularis. Those are the actions. AB, EX, EX, IN. If you know that, that's really going to help you quite a bit. Okay, now let's just see if there is anything else that I want to cover. Let me look at the other. Okay, so we did that. Let's look at here. Let's just see if this helps at all. Now this one is showing the arm in the right position because it's hanging down, right? So here, number 7, this is the deltoid. Here, number 2 is the infraspinatus. Here's Teres Minor. Here's Teres Major. Number 9, this is anterior, so this is the Biceps Brachii. Between the biceps and the triceps, that's where you have the brachialis, right? So the arm can get pretty thick based on these 3 muscles right here. Now we're looking at the anterior scapula, so that's the subscapularis. Remember, internal rotation. Here is the pec major, but it's the clavicular portion. There's a sternal division and a clavicular division. So this is the clavicular division of pec major. Here is the deltoid, and here is the biceps brachii. Now we're looking at the arm from the medial view. Here's the biceps brachii. Here's the triceps. And the brachialis would be between the two. Kind of hard to see in this view. You have to really look at it more from the lateral view. What we see here, kind of sandwiched between number 9 and 11, this would be the coracobrachialis, because that's the coracoid process. Okay. Here's the anterior forearm. So let's look at 12, 13, and 14. That's where I said if you put your thenar pad over your forearm and you put those 4 fingers displayed, well, here's the Pronator Teres, here's the Flexor Carpi Radialis, and here's the Palmaris Longus. We can't quite see the Flexor Carpi Ulnaris because it's more medial. Here is your Biceps Brachii, and then antagonistically, Triceps Brachii. On the posterior side, let's look at 16, 17, 18, and 19, and we can look at a little bit of 20 here. So 16, these are extensors, so is number 17, and so is number 18 and 19. They're all on the posterior side. Think extensors. If you put your hand over the lateral epicondyle and you extend your wrist, you can see how the belly of those muscles contract. If you put your hand on the medial epicondyle and you flex your fingers or flex the wrist, you can see those bellies contract. So 16 is on the ulnar side. It's an extensor. Let's give it a name, extensor carpi ulnaris. 17 crosses the digits. Let's call it an extensor digitorum. Now 18 and 19, these are the ECRL and ECRB. 18 is the extensor carpi radialis brevis. 19 is the extensor carpi radialis longus. And then the mobile wad of 3, the third belly, is the brachioradialis. Okay, so we'll stop it there. In our next lecture, we'll cover the lower extremity.